in this module, we're going to look at when ICM starts to impact post flop. And historically, people have thought that ICM has very little impact early on in tournaments. People say, stick to a ChipEV, play until you get near the bubble, or, I heard I heard Darren Elias do a podcast recently where he said he doesn't really think about ICM until half the remaining people are getting paid. This is a graph we've seen elsewhere. It describes the average bubble factors risk premiums in the PokerStars million at different stages of the tournament. And as you can see, it starts pretty low and it rises. And the nearer we get to the bubble, the more steeply it rises. And then it comes to that peak on the bubble. And then immediately after the bubble, it comes crashing down again. And then, it jagged line again, and it starts to rise again as we get near the final table. What we're going to focus on in this video is what is the point at which you have to start thinking differently about post flop due to ICM? How early in the tournament is it a factor? We can see that once we get to the bubble, ICM is clearly a factor. Less so immediately after the bubble or when the final table is a long way off, but it's still a factor. But at the start, you can see that the bubble factors are quite low. So is there any impact at all, or is the general consensus view that we can just play a ChipEV strategy correct? So that's what we're going to look at here. So we'll hand over to Barry, who has actually run a few sims.
Thank you, Dara. I was very interested in this before we decided to make this course, specifically in the context of late registration. I was curious about whether we should be adjusting our post-flop strategy from the moment we late register, because we're going to late register with, say, 40% of the field gone at least. And invariably, if you late register, you're probably going to be at a table with a bunch of regs if you get put on the late reg table. So I was very interested. So I've picked an interesting hand. I've done a bunch of these. I could have picked a very straightforward hand, and I would have proven myself right, and I would have seen the bet sizes gradually go down quite quickly across a number of situations. But I've actually picked a hand where I'm a little bit stumped as to one of the adjustments. So I know we're not supposed to go into massive in-depth post-flop analysis here, but we may end up doing just because it's interesting. So let me tell you the situation. This is a 30 big blind effective stack situation, and it's under the gun against the big blind defend, single raise pot, and the flop is 9-6-4. The reason I picked this is because I know this to be a board where you'll see some large betting and some over betting. It's the right conditions. If you've seen our other course, you'll know this is the right conditions for an overbet. And what I've done is I've run the sim first of all in ChipEV, and then in multiple situations where we're in a tournament. So it starts with a 200 runner tournament with 200 players remaining, so 100% of the field is there. And then we're going to lose 40 players in each sim. So then we'll get an idea for the different gradients in ICM. Now, in every single situation, the average stack is the same as the effective stacks, which is 30 big blinds. And I'd say perhaps crucially for what makes this sim interesting is both stacks are identical. So there isn't a covering player, or they are both covering players, depending on how you think about it. And that's going to warp the strategy slightly. Normally there is a clear covering player and a clear covered player. But it still makes it very interesting. So before we jump in, what do you think of that dynamic where all the stacks are the same size?
Yeah, that obviously does create the biggest ICM. Like if you have a short stack playing against a big stack, the big stack has very little ICM, and we could expect him to be playing not just close to a ChipEV strategy, but if the other player has any sort of significant ICM on him, more aggressive than ChipEV. But when they both can hurt each other, they both have the same ICM essentially, and therefore we're going to see a more true reflection of the pure effect of the ICM at that stage.
Got it.
Obviously, at the start of a tournament, the bubble factors risk premiums should be very low. You're talking about like 2 to 3%. So you might think, okay, well, there probably should be very little difference, but that's essentially what we're testing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, 9-6-4 flop, under the gun, single raise pot against the big blind. This is ChipEV. So this is what the solver would do in in a cash game type situation. And as you can see, it's a mixed strategy. This is a polarized flop. Almost 40% of the time, under the gun player will check back. There's a mix of bet sizes, but as you can see, the predominant bet size is quite large. It's
Yeah.
31%.
Yeah.
And this would be with hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, the sort of the very good one pair hands that are strong, beats the big blinds range quite significantly, but are vulnerable. So
Yeah.
look, go on, Dara.
Yeah, this is a classic big bet board or over bet board. If they were deeper, we'd be seeing an even bigger bet size being used. 82% is the big bet when it's 30 blinds effective. So we're seeing all the vulnerable top pairs and all the more vulnerable over pairs. They have a strong incentive to bet now because there are so many bet big because there are so many bad turn cards for them. And then other parts of our range just don't want to bet because this isn't a board where we can get away with range betting. So it's a big bet or check board basically.
Now, as you mentioned, a lot of players would assume that at the very, very start of a tournament it's pure ChipEV. So let's look at what happens in this exact same situation, but with 100% of the players remaining in a tournament. And before we even do anything, the strategy has actually changed quite significantly. Most notably, so I'm just going to go back and forth between the two screens. So there's quite a lot less checking. So there's quite a lot more betting. And there's more bets across the board, but most notably, there's a overbet size used. And yeah, I'd say that's the thing that sticks out more significantly. So let's just quickly look at the bubble factors. And yeah, it's a bubble factor of 1.08.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah,
only
as I
out.
predicted, my guess was 2% for the risk premium, and that sounds about
Mm.
right. So it's not particularly significant, and yet we're seeing, or it doesn't look particularly significant, yet we are seeing a difference in the strategy.
So I'm going to ask you about why the overbets happen in a moment, Dara. But let's quickly cycle through the other stage of the tournament because I think if we just quickly scan through them, it will show you the way that it shifts. So once again, this is ChipEV. This is 100% of the players remain in the tournament. It's a 200 runner tournament, remember. This is with 160 players remaining, so 40 players are gone, or 20% of the field is gone. A little bit of a change. We're actually seeing two things. So the overbet is still there. We're actually seeing an increase in the small betting as well, just slightly. But let's keep moving on. So once again, ChipEV, 100% of the players remaining, 80% of the players remaining. Now this is 60% of the field remaining. The overbets have gone up. Everything else is somewhat staying the same. And now this is I've lost right. This is 80 players remaining. The overbets have gone up again considerably. The small bets have also started to increase significantly. We're at like almost 30% of the hands that we bet are in the small bet category. And then this is with 40 players remaining, which is just no, this is it's 40 players remaining, which is close to the bubble. We've now seen that the overbets have reduced. The 84% bet has increased a little bit. And there's a significant increase in the small betting and also in the overall betting frequency. This will be Dara because there is both players have ICM pressure on each other and being the same stack, and neither of them wanting to tangle. So when it checks to under the gun, this guy can take some liberties, right?
Yeah. At first, this seems a little bit confusing, but the concept I would use to start trying to understand this is a concept we talk about in our original book, in Game Poker Strategy, the ICM book, where we talked about this min or all in, where often in ICM extreme situations, we see the solver move in two directions. It either bets small, like really small, or it just moves all in and makes a really big bet. Now, we're not seeing the all in here because that would be ridiculous. That would be several times pot, but we are seeing that the overbet being used. So at the earlier stages when we're at the exact start of the tournament, or we have or not a huge number of players have been eliminated. We're seeing quite a lot of this overbet, and the overbet size is bigger than ChipEV. And I think the easiest way to understand this, and this is something that very good tournament players have talked about in the past, sometimes controversially, sometimes cash players say, you're using donkey big sizings. But in a tournament, it actually becomes more important to just win your hand, win hands, advance, move on. Now, at the start of a tournament, you're not as worried about busting. So you have a fairly wide, robust range of hands that you can stack off with. So, if you overbet an overpair and they shove, you're calling. If you overbet a bunch of nines, maybe you'll fold some of your weakest nines to a shove, but your stack off range is much wider than it would be later on in the tournament when ICM is a factor. So you actually have quite a lot of hands that can overbet, and you're not going to get exploited by having to fold too many of those value hands. You have a wide value range, therefore you can have a wide bluff range as well. And by using this big sizing, remember, the bigger the sizing you use, the more bluffing you get to do. So that's a secondary advantage. Winning hands in tournaments is a very good thing. In a cash game, you're really just focused on trying to win as much chips as possible. But in a tournament, anytime you win a hand, that's a good result. So I think that's a difference we're seeing here. So even though the ICM isn't major, our basic tournament strategy is like we want to win as many hands as possible. So we want to have as wide as a value range as we can, and then if we use a big size, we get to do more bluffing as well. We can turn all the king tens, king jacks, king queens, all the light overbets that you see there. They also work. If we're getting shoved, we're just folding, obviously. But we have enough ace nine, king nine, overpairs, etc., to support this range. So that's why we're seeing the big bet predominate. But then we have other size hands that are a bit weaker. A hand like 10-9 suited. Or weaker draws like 10-8 suited. They have some interest in betting, but they don't really fit in an overbet range. But we can bet them at a small size. A lot of good things can happen. We can get called by worse hands. We can get some folds. We can fold out equity. So we have some interest in having a small bet range as well. So that's why we see this split between the big bet range, which is robust in the sense that it has all our strongest value and appropriate amount of bluffs, and then the smaller bet range as well. And then we use the smaller bet range as well with some very strong hands that block value. The sets, for example, 9, 6s, 4s. If we're going to bet those, we're not going to overbet them because they're blocking so many continues. So we have two ranges here that make perfect sense. The strong but vulnerable overbet range for value mixed in with a lot of bluffs, and the smaller size with fewer bluffs that are either less strong, vulnerable hands or very, very strong hands that actually would love if our opponent pounced on the small size and raised.
Yeah. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this specific hand and the overbetting strategy, because first of all, it's not actually as common as this may make you think. Like a lot of the examples I did where it was mostly just small betting that we did. I just want us to get a sense that, look, ICM is relevant from the start, and look how the strategy changes. The strategy between two phases might not look that different, but the difference between this and this is quite stark. So what we might need explaining here is this is ChipEV. This is 100% of the players remaining in the tournament. And as you can see, the strategy is already different. So to answer the question, when is ICM relevant post-flop? The answer is immediately. But why? Why are the people who think playing a ChipEV strategy at the start, why are they wrong?
Well, first of all, the differences are minor, as you say, and they kind of flow from the bet size that we're using for our big size. The bigger size we use for our big bet, the stronger our value has to be. So, when we're using 83% pot and we bet Jack 9 suited, 10-9 suited, we can get called by a lot of worse hands. But when we go up to 125% pot, we're going to fold out most of those worse hands, and our hand. So our value threshold is higher the bigger size we use. So you can see that on the left in the ChipEV example, we're going all the way down to Jack 9 suited, bluffing at a reasonable frequency, 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, etc. But on the other side, we are seeing not much over betting with Jack nine suit, for example, because the size has just become too big now. Um, and and also less bluffing. As I said, like the bigger size we use, the more bluffs we get to do. So that's kind of the major difference. Our our strong but vulnerable hands, because it's a tournament, they kind of just like to win the pot more often. They're more incentivized to win the pot, and that's what's pushing the size up. And because we're using that bigger size, then we have a higher value threshold. So therefore, if you look at the betting frequencies, when we use 125% of pot, we only get to bet roughly a quarter of our range.
Mm.
Um, and that will include both less value and less bluffs. Uh, but when we're using the 82%, we bet a lot more value. And therefore we're betting almost 32%. And I think that's the major difference. Like we can never tell for sure, because we can't ask the solver like, why are you doing this? But
Yeah.
instinctively or intuitively, this is what makes the most sense to me. And yeah, it's really just a function of the sizing, because we've decided in a tournament we want to use an even bigger sizing. Therefore, our value threshold goes up.
Yeah. Yeah. So practically, a lot of people might see something like this, especially since the post flop ICM feature in GTO Wizard has come out, and think that they've been playing the first sort of 20 levels of a tournament incorrectly. So practically, how much should we be adjusting from ChipEV from the start? Are those ChipEV sims that most people have seen before, are they still useful, or should we be ripping up the rulebook entirely?
I think they're useful. It's really only around the fringes that they kind of make a difference.
Mm,
It would be interesting to look at the EV of both players in both of these sims and see how much we gain by using the bigger size. Um,
okay. So, do you want to do the
yeah.
overbet,
So if we do,
even though it's
if we look at
even though it's rarely used?
yeah, so if you go to ranges, and oh yeah, so there we have it there. Yeah, so the EV, uh yeah, the EVs are, you can see the EVs are actually, sorry, the equities are identical, but the
Mhm.
EV on the left side in percentage terms is lower, but we are kind of going to win the pot. But I suspect that if we reran the sim and
Mhm.
forced it to play the chip EV strategy, I don't
Mhm.
think there would be a massive difference in EV, if I'm honest.
There won't. I'm going to save everybody's who's interested in this a lot of time. I actually did a bunch of this for my freelancing work at GTO Wizard, and I ran a bunch of sims where I node locked and put a chip EV strategy into an ICM situation for a player, and the amount of EV that is sacrificed was disappointingly small. I say disappointing because I'd written an article about it, and I was like, wow, this isn't going to be a particularly interesting article after the fact. So it wasn't dramatic. Now, when you get to like rivers and bubbles and stuff like that, obviously, then it's going to make a big difference. But for the most part, it didn't make a huge difference.
Yeah, and it won't. And I think that's one major takeaway. Like if you stick to a chip EV strategy in the early stages of a tournament, or even right at the start of a tournament, you're sacrificing a tiny amount of EV. Now, if you're playing 100Ks where every little piece of EV is very
Mm,
important, then yeah, maybe this stuff becomes important. Much less so if you're playing at the lower stakes. But at the same time, it is still nice to pick up a little bit of extra EV if you can.
mm,
Particularly if you're an online player who's playing 20,000 tournaments a year. Like if you can add even 0.1% to your overall ROI, that'll add up over the year. We are saying on the one hand, it makes very little difference to your EV. But on the other hand, it's nice to pick up that extra EV if you can. And the the general patterns are easy to identify. Just the sizing of your value goes up, and your value threshold goes up. You use a bigger
mm,
size with your value, but you use a higher value threshold. That's a fairly easy lesson to learn. Like if you're in a
mm,
spot where you think, okay, I'm probably at the bottom of my value here in a chip EV spot, and you've watched this and you've heard us say that the value threshold goes up, then you might think, okay, I shouldn't be betting this hand maybe then, because even though it's the start of a tournament. And on the other hand, if you're looking at a hand which is a clear slam dunk bet, you're like, yeah, this is definitely a bet. This is an overpair. But you've drawn the lesson from this module that you can actually use a bigger size, then that will also add a bit of EV to your thing. And it's very easily actionable. It's not like the ranges are radically different and you have to learn something completely new. All you have to learn is chip away at the bottom of the value threshold and bet the rest at a bigger size.
So final question, when would you start to consciously deviate from a chippy fee strategy? Like is my hunch that the max late reg threshold is about when?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's probably earlier than people think. Like if you can go back maybe to show the ChipEV strategy versus say the when 60% of the field are left.
Yeah. So on the left we have ChipEV, on the right we have 60% of the field remaining.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see at this stage already there is starting to be a fairly significant difference. Uh, we First of all, we're using the bigger size, and
Yeah.
and that is actually the predominant size. But we're also using quite a bit of smaller size betting as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the big bet range, even though we're using the bigger size, we're actually doing more of it. Um, so when we have a very strong but vulnerable hand, we're just betting it more frequently uh, as an overbet. And then we're choosing the appropriate bluffs as well. Uh, but we also have parts of the range, the very strong hands that block continues, the sets, the weaker top pair like 10-9 suited, they have an interest in betting too. But we're actually in that area, we're going all the way down to tiny bet. We're not even using the smaller bet. So we're seeing this mineral in thing where if we decide our hand is strong enough, we're kind of just committing with it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's really there really seems to be very little function for a middling size bet in most situations. I've found chip EV or ICM are like the middling bets achieve the least, I guess, right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And like typically we either have a very strong hand that we're trying to reduce action with,
Mhm.
and that can go into the small bet range we're hoping to get a raise, or a weak hand where we're just trying to fold out equity. And that also belongs in the small bet range. And then we have strong but vulnerable hands that want to put lots of chips in. You're right, like the half pot bet, which traditionally, before solvers, that was the size most people used.
Yeah.
A lot of times it just achieves nothing. I remember doing an early coaching session with Stephen Keogh, and we were talking about bet sizings, and he was like, "Yeah, what's even the point of the half pot bet?" And like there often is no point. On an aside, as a pure exploitative thing, one thing I've definitely noticed out in the field, when live players bluff, they almost always use half pot. It's
Mm.
like they don't want to bet small because they know they'll
Yeah.
get called too much, but they don't want to bet big either because they'll look stupid, they'll look foolish if they get called and they'll have lost too many chips. So it's like the half pot bet is the compromise size.
I'd say that's true on online as well, because half pot is often a preset bet
Yeah.
on the bet slider. So some people might use it because they can't think of what else to do.
Yeah. And it's just like I don't want to bet small, but I don't want to bet big. So guess what? Half pot. Okay, so to summarize what we've covered here, we've looked at when ICM has any impact and when it has a significant impact. And the answer to when it has any impact is actually a little bit surprising right from the start of a tournament. Um, ICM does minorly change the strategy even at the very start. It's fairly minor, and you're not giving up much EV if you stick to a chip EV strategy. But the takeaways are fairly simple to learn, and it has a very significant impact or at least a significant impact when 60% of the field is left. And the closer we get to the bubble, the more significant it becomes. But the reason why it's useful to start implementing it even from the start is the takeaways are kind of very simple. Big bets get bigger, small bets get smaller, and medium bets disappear. When we have an actual value hand which wants to be protected, it's a much bigger result for us in a tournament when we take down the pot with that hand
Mm.
because we get to move on, we get to increase our stack. Getting sucked out on in a cash game doesn't hurt us at all so long as we charge the guy the right price. But getting sucked out in a tournament can eliminate us from the tournament. So that's a fundamental difference between tournament strategy and cash game strategy. Unless it's a re-entry tournament and still in the re-entry phase, then you can maybe make an argument it reverts more towards cash game strategy.
Mm.
But there is more value in taking the pot down rather than building a pot in tournaments. And in terms of the bet sizes, you can kind of think about like why this would be. Why do big bets get bigger? Well, we want to win the pot more often. We want to protect our hand more often. It kind of makes sense, therefore, to use a bigger size. Why do small bets get smaller? Well, remember, when there's even any ICM pressure on somebody, they're going to have to fold more. So the small bet is effective. It gets the job done with the part of the range that we want. And if we have a value hand, a really strong value hand like a set that blocks their continues, well, the smaller bet is more likely to get called. But the smaller bet also generates more folds because of ICM. So therefore, when we're bluffing, it allows us to bluff for cheaper. So that's essentially what drives the bet size. It's almost like an accordion effect. You're pulling the accordion apart. The big bets are getting bigger on one side, but the small bets are getting smaller.
Yeah, sorry to interject right at the end, but the biggest single takeaway I took away from our work on the ICM book, a book which we're very, very pleased to say has completely held up since Post Flop ICM has become a thing on GTO Wizard, was that the function of the small bet. I always we'll see throughout this series, but I was really surprised. I always assumed the small bet, which increased in ICM spots, was because it was a very cheap way to get folds. But if you actually look, the calling frequencies actually go up when the bets are smaller in
Yeah.
ICM spots, because it's a way of milking value where they otherwise would not get it, and that was a huge takeaway for me.
Yeah, it's maybe the most important line we've ever written, and it's in another book, which is that your value determines your strategy, which we
Mm.
have in GTO Poker Simplified. Our value when in ICM extreme situations is desperate to get value, and if it continues using bigger sizes, it's just going to get too many folds. So that's what essentially drives the sizing down. It's like when we have a value hand, we do want to get that extra bit of value. And therefore the smaller size makes sense with a lot of our range, particularly the value that's going to be hard to get called, like the top set, which is blocking top pair. That really wants to use a smaller size and just kind of milk more out of more hands in his range. So in this module, we have looked at we've started to look at the way ICM changes strategy, and in particular the point of a tournament where it changes, and slightly surprising result that even on the very first hand, it's different from ChipEV. But we have just introduced the idea and the major concept. We're going to do a deep dive now on different types of boards and lots of different situations, and try and get a fuller picture, and that's what will follow in the following modules.
This video was an excerpt from Post Flop ICM Simplified, the new course from simplifypoker.com. If you head over to simplifypoker.com, you can get access to this course at a $200 discount. And if you sign up to our mailing list, you can also get a free course and ebook on modern poker study.